Welcome, APUSH students. Chapter 25 right here. Going to be talking about America's entry into World War II. And here you'll see some of the things that get us on the road to war. A lot of these you should already know really from your world history classes, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You know that the rise of fascism that begins in the 1920s with Benito Mussolini, of course, spreads to Germany under Adolf Hitler. And that one of the big things here is that the League of Nations does nothing. America's not in it. America's in isolationism. And they do nothing as Germany's aggression spreads and as Italy's aggression spreads. Nothing to help. Okay, now some more American stuff here. The Nye Committee in 1934 alleged that the United States became involved in World War I to make money for munition companies. So this is kind of a big deal because it's going to help keep us out of the war. And the idea is that that America profited off of World War I, which I can see that there is an argument there. This would inspire the very important Neutrality Act of 1935, which you must know. And under the Neutrality Act, the United States of America could not sell weapons to belligerent countries, meaning warring countries, like we did. Remember, in World War I, we sold weapons to Britain and France, and we loaned them money. And if they lost, then we lost our investment. So this is to kind of try to keep America out of European wars, especially because, 100,000 American men went over there and died. Some would argue in the Nye Committee that it was simply to make rich people richer. So they don't want that happening again. Popular Front advocated European intervention. They supported loyalists in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War is a war between fascism and democracy, and the fascists will win there. But America doesn't really do much to intervene in the Spanish Civil War. And some would argue that they let democracy fall there. Meanwhile, Hitler is sending money and stuff to the fascist leader there. Appeasement, a term you should be familiar with. Remember that Britain and France appeased Hitler. They let him have what he wanted to keep out of war. And we know it was a huge failure. It allowed Hitler to be the bully and allowed him to grow strong and very bold and daring. In appeasement, the Munich Conference gave Germany the Sudetenland. This is going to basically start off Hitler's true quest and hunger for power. And then Prime Minister Richard Chamberlain at the time of Great Britain said that it was a peace for our time. Instead, others, such as Winston Churchill, criticized Chamberlain and said that appeasement would end very poorly for Europe. And he was right, it did. Hitler is not worried about the Europeans. He has now tested them, and he sees that the Europeans will let him do pretty much anything to keep out of war. So from a European standpoint, World War II begins September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. Britain and France finally get their heads out of their butts and realize that Hitler won't stop, that he would take whatever he can possibly get his hands on. Others would argue that World War II began 2 years earlier when Japan invaded China in 1937. But regardless, September 1st, 1939 is an important date because it's going to pull a lot of the main powers into the war. Again, America is smack dab in the middle of isolationism. We're dealing with the Great Depression. We are looking internally at ourselves. This Committee to Defend America, however, they advocated that the United States should aid their allies, that we, I don't know if that we owed Britain and France anything, certainly, but that they were our friends and that we needed to help them. However, their opponents were the America First Committee. They were isolationists. One of the prominent members was Charles Lindbergh, who flew solo across the Atlantic in the Spirit of St. Louis airplane. So sort of setting up like World War I, where there's a lot of nobody's on the same page. Everybody kind of wants something different in and how we should handle Europe. However, FDR is becoming pretty good friends with Winston Churchill, and he is basically going around the Neutrality Acts In the beginning, he trades destroyers with Great Britain for military bases. This is something a thing called destroyers for bases. Technically, he's not breaking the Neutrality Act because he's not selling them weapons. He's trading. He's giving them destroyers, and Great Britain is giving America bases on Great Britain soil. They'll do this with several other things. They'll do the Lend-Lease Act. So, however he can get around the Neutrality Acts, FDR really is. We get the first peacetime draft in American history. Men are drafted into the Army and war is not declared. That's in 1940. America won't go into war until December 7th, 1941, or technically, I guess, the day after. That's Pearl Harbor, of course. FDR is going to give his Four Freedoms speech, basically freedoms that every person should enjoy. And he linked the war with democracy, that this was a war between democracy and fascism, and that if America didn't get involved, that the fascists would win and democracy would die. And that, again, that puts you to a point where one day down the line, perhaps it's just America, whether it's communist or fascist, perhaps one day it's just America trying to defend their way of life. So we don't want to let our friends down who happen to be democracy countries. The Lend-Lease Act, I mentioned it earlier. The United States could lend military supplies to countries deemed vital to U.S. security. So it gets that passed again. This is all working around the 1935 Neutrality Acts. FDR is obviously pretty clever, and he has enough support to get this to happen. The Atlantic Charter is one that you need to make sure you know. Basically, FDR and Winston Churchill, who's now the Prime Minister of Great Britain, they are trying to see what their goals are for after the war, economic cooperation between our two countries, self-determination for colonies and things like that, and political stability so that something like this doesn't happen again. People are already looking at the terrible Treaty of Versailles as a major reason for the rise of Hitler and getting us to this point in front of World War II. Well, so we get attacked by the Japanese in December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They attack our U.S. Pacific Fleet. They catch us totally, off guard. They have diplomats. What makes it even worse is there are Japanese diplomats in Washington, D.C. while this attack is underway, talking about peace and everything between our two countries. And then they basically sneak in the back door and do this, pretty bad thing. Well, it galvanizes the country, as you can imagine, to imagine that we've been attacked. And this is the first time we've been attacked on our own soil in over 100 years. Everybody comes together. Now it's a lot different than World War I. So we're in it. We declare war on Japan, but then FDR does something that angers some people. He declares war on Germany as well. He is persuaded by Winston Churchill that America needs to send troops not only to Japan, but to Europe as well, or they're going to fall to Hitler's forces, which are definitely a juggernaut sweeping across Europe. I mean, it only took Hitler, like 3 or 4 weeks to take out France. It was embarrassing for the French people. So Britain is hanging on by a toenail, and they need America there. But for some Americans, we were attacked by the Japanese, not the Germans, so they don't want involved in Europe. They just want to make the Japanese pay. But anyway, we're in it. We're going to fight a two-front war. We're going to do it better than the Germans ever could have imagined in their attempts at two-front war in both of the world wars. But we got to pay for this thing. And one of the ways we do it, the Revenue Act of 1942, increased the number of Americans paying taxes. Some of the richer people are now going to be paying taxes, ones who didn't have to pay taxes before, and that's going to help boost our money. Also, the government borrows money to pay for the war, okay, which, it's not ideal, but something that's going to happen. You get the War Productions Board, which encouraged businesses to begin military production, such as General Motors and Ford. Again, this is a repeat of what happened in World War I. Henry Kaiser, contractor, applied Ford's mass production techniques to ship construction. They create the Liberty ships, and they're basically cranking out a battleship or a destroyer in 24 hours. Though they have 3 crews working 8 hours round the clock, and they make a bunch of prefabricated parts, and they used the assembly line process that Ford made so famous in his factory. And every 24 hours, brand new battleship, goes out into the Atlantic and helps the war cause. So very important there. A staggering 15 million Americans joined the armed forces in World War II. However, it's a mixed bag. African Americans are allowed to go, but they have to be in segregated units. However, Native Americans, while there was a little discrimination against them, they end up playing an instrumental role as code talkers. They would, in World War II, a big part of the fighting was breaking the other side's codes so that you could find out when their attacks were coming. And Native Americans like the Navajo, they would speak their own language to each other, and it wasn't on books anywhere. The Japanese couldn't crack the code because they didn't know the Navajo language. Meanwhile, we have Japanese Americans who are helping us break Japanese code, so we have a huge advantage in communication there, and really plays a vital role in some battles, some really cool battles like the Battle of Midway out in the Pacific. And again, AP doesn't focus on the battles, or we talk a little bit more about some of those battles, but there's some interesting ones, as you can imagine, in World War II, which is the greatest conflict that's ever happened on planet Earth. Women are involved in military too, but mostly they're secretaries. They could be in some communication stuff, healthcare work. There were some women pilots in World War II. But they wouldn't fly combat missions. They would fly like supply drops and stuff like that. But women are getting a bigger role in World War II than ever before in our history. Okay, we get our famous Rosie the Riveter, and there's a lot of similarities between World War I and World War II. Just World War II is a little bit bigger. So women are going to go into the workforce and do their thing, just like they did in World War One. We get the famous promotional ad, Rosie the Riveter, which you all know. She's in her blue collar shirt, flexing for the camera and all that. Now they're still getting paid less than men, unfortunately. And like World War One, when the men come home from World War II, women are encouraged to go back to the home. But still, this gives women a taste of freedom, a taste of autonomy that many of them cherish. And it's going to help move us closer to equality in the country for women's rights, and really for the civil rights. World War II was going to help push us down the road towards more rights for African Americans and other minority groups. All right, wartime. Speaking of civil rights, wartime civil rights, you get the Double V campaign, Double Victory, which is victory in Europe against fascism and victory at home against racism. One of their main leaders was A. Philip Randolph, a man who had planned to march on Washington, D.C., and would end up, he threatens to march on Washington, D.C., and FDR doesn't want this. He wants everybody focused on this massive war, and he doesn't believe that they have time to, to fight at home and abroad. But Randolph doesn't back down. He tells FDR that his people need this, and that the president should be looking out for them. And so he does. So what the president does is he issues Executive Order 8802, which is going to give African Americans a chance to work in defense industries, because those jobs were the good paying jobs, and African Americans, for the most part, weren't allowed to work in them. Those jobs were going to white men. But the executive order is going to help break up a little bit of that. And, it's not clear across the board, but they're going to get more African Americans in those jobs than before. So that's a success for A. Philip Randolph. It's a success for civil rights in America as well. The Congress of Racial Equality was created in 1942. That's going to turn around and become influential in the civil rights marches of the 1960s. Organized labor, of course, is also affected by World War II. The National War Labor Board established pay, hours, and working conditions. Basically, the government's going to come in and say, this is what's going to happen. The Smith-Connolly Act prohibited strikes in defense industries. It does say, hey, we're at war, so you cannot strike for more wages during this war. When the war's over, that's a different story. But during the war, we can't afford you to be striking and possibly getting people killed, our boys getting killed overseas. As you can see there to the right, we can do it. That's Rosie the Riveter. Obviously, it's very famous. And we see over here in our key concept, wartime experiences such as the internment of Japanese Americans, challenges to civil liberties, debates over race and segregation, and the decision to drop the atomic bomb raise questions about American values. There's a hypocrisy here. We're fighting for freedoms, but not everybody enjoys those freedoms here in America. When the Japanese attacked, we freaked out a little bit, and we took all those Japanese people in California, so many of them, and put them in camps, concentration camps. Now, these aren't Hitler level concentration camps, but these people were kicked out of their homes. A lot of their property was lost, and they had to stay in these camps. Two of them were actually in Arkansas. Um, they're worried about them being spies for the Japanese government. There's a lot of hatred towards the Japanese because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And yet you still had 100,000 or more Japanese Americans go fight in World War II, even though this was being done to their people. So they did end up coming back, I think, in the 80s or so, and paying the Japanese some restitution. Those that were put in internment camps were paid some money. Basically, we're sorry we did that money. Whoops. Politics in wartime. We get Service Readjustment Act, which is very, very important, but it's more famously known as the GI Bill, which provided education, loans, mortgages, etc. for returning soldiers. This is a huge deal. It's a reward for the men who went over there and fought overseas. It gave them basically free education. It gave them great loan interest rates on loans for homes and stuff. We were doing right by our soldiers there. All right. At home, on the home front, Americans help out by recycling. They also had victory gardens. Just like World War I, they're doing the rationing. We're making sure that everything we can gets to our soldiers. But this does mean that there was a shortage of consumer goods because factories weren't making consumer goods. They were making products that would help out in the war cause. So, that year you might not get to buy brand new clothes during the war. I mean, it upset everything on the home front, even though it wasn't being fought here in America. You had a lot of people, famous athletes such as Ted Williams, one of the greatest baseball players of all time, that left the major leagues and went and flew planes, combat missions in World War II. So even though this war wasn't taking place in our shores, it affected daily life for everybody. Again, another 15 million Americans moved during the war. You get another basically migration, like a great migration. People going to cities to take jobs in factories. California benefited more than any other state. A lot of that's because there were a lot of defense industries in California. So a lot of people were going there to get the good money jobs. You did have racial conflict going on because, again, there are people who use the war to aid their cause, these minority groups. And I can't blame them for that, but you had things like the Zoot Suit riot. Zoot Suit was basically these suits that were popular that Mexican Americans wore. Kind of think if you've ever seen Jim Carrey and The Mask, that's like a Zoot Suit, had like the long tails and stuff and the hats. But the Zoot Suit riot was conflict in Southern California between servicemen and Mexican Americans. You had gay and lesbian communities. Strong gay communities emerged in large cities. And this is going to, this stems back to really the 1920s, but it's gaining a little momentum out in California. And it's going to get bigger in the very rebellious 60s and 70s time period. So that will come back. Here, talking about the internment camps. The order for Japanese removal to the camps was Executive Order 9066, and it took them off the West Coast to relocation camps. Like I said, there were two of them in Arkansas at Jerome and oh man, I can't remember the other one, but there were two in Arkansas. 2 out of 3 of those affected were Nisei, who were American-born Japanese citizens. So, there were those who migrated here. And there were those who migrated here from Japan, who were first-generation immigrants, but the Nisei were their children. and they were born on American soil, so they were American citizens. But 66% of all the people relocated were American citizens. So obviously that's a big civil rights issue there and made certain groups of Americans very angry. However, when this was brought to trial, when it was challenged in Korematsu versus United States in 1944, it was deemed, because of the dire situation of World War II, that it was constitutionally okay to do so. But again, we will give them money back later on. We acknowledge that what we did was wrong. All right. The big three: FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. Churchill and Stalin despise each other. When you look at pictures of the three, you'll probably always see that FDR is in the middle of Churchill and Stalin. The two despised each other. You get the Tehran Conference. Churchill and FDR agreed to open a second front in France. This is important because it's a big point. We're gonna have a nice little debate on who was at fault for the Cold War. Was it America's fault or was it Russia's fault? And from Joseph Stalin's standpoint, um, America took far too long to open a second front, and it was the Russians who were bleeding the Germans, but they were losing staggering amounts of men. The Russians are going to lose about 20 million people during World War II, and they're the ones that are really keeping the Germans occupied to the point where they can't overrun everybody else on the Allied forces. So the Tehran Conference is important. FDR finally agrees. He says, "Hey, we're going to send American troops to France to get France back." This is not since 1939. America's been in it since 1941. So 3 years. I mean, we landed troops we landed troops all over the place, but not in France. Not trying to take German occupied lands back from Germany. So this will help obviously turn the tide of the war. June 6th, very famous. That's D-Day, and that was the invasion of Normandy, which was in France. It is the turning point in the war. It's the largest land, sea, air invasion in human history. I think there were some 3 million Allied soldiers involved in it. Just a huge, massive operation that was under the control of the United States. And this is very bloody, storming the beaches there. And we would push the Germans out of France. So the French people will get their country back. The Holocaust, you know all about the Holocaust. 6 million Jews are killed. And, America, it says here, U.S. turns away German ship with 1,000 Jewish refugees. But it wasn't just America. There were many countries. We had accepted tens of thousands of German immigrants before this time period. But at some point, we say enough's enough. I don't think we knew that Germans were being executed in these gas chambers at the time. We don't really know that until we get into Germany and see the horrors of the Holocaust. But we knew that things were rough for Jews. And, America and these other countries kind of turned their backs on the Jews. So 21,000 Jewish refugees allowed to enter the United States during the war. Remember, I told you it's a two-front war. In the Pacific, one of the big battles I mentioned earlier was the Battle of Midway, which was a turning point in the Pacific War. The fighting in the Pacific is a different kind of fighting. The airplane is immensely important, and you're going to have aircraft carriers who are, the aircraft carriers will send their planes to fight, and you got all these dog fights and stuff like that. So we also used island hopping. We would hop over islands that were too strongly defended and take smaller islands first, and then we come back and get them when we were ready. Massive battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They're bloody. Now, we're killing about 3 Japanese for every one of ours, but it's still bloody. And to invade Japan itself, it was estimated that some 500,000 to 1 million Allied lives would be lost trying to take Japan. And that, of course, millions and millions of Japanese would be killed if we had to invade their home islands and take them out there. The Japanese were training even schoolgirls to be able to defend uh, to defend Japan itself. So it would have been a very bloody ordeal. However, as things would have it, we had been working on a special new weapon called the atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb was one of those things where, you know, Albert Einstein was a Jewish immigrant from Germany who came to America, and he wrote a letter to FDR saying that the Germans were working on splitting the atom to make a weapon out of it, and that the United States of America had to get there before the Germans, or it was going to be very, very bad. And so that got the Americans started, and they put together the very secret Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project has like 70,000 scientists involved in it, and only a few of them actually know what they're building. They're only told, we need you to build this. And another group would be told, we need you to build this. Many of them didn't even know that they were building the atomic bomb, only the ones at the top. They even had a secret city in Tennessee of 70,000 scientists that didn't exist on a map. There were no roads going into it. It was, it's a pretty neat little thing. And so the Manhattan Project cost $2 billion to build the atomic bomb. It was headed by J. Robert Oppenheimer, who famously says after the building of the atomic bomb that he had become death, the destroyer of worlds, basically a Hindu line, a Hindu reference. This happens in 1945 out in New Mexico, Los Alamos, New Mexico. And only days, well, I say days, I mean, it gets on a boat right after. You're going to see about a 2-week period before it gets dropped. The atomic bombs, there's 2 of them that are dropped, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. The Japanese refused to surrender after the first one. We waited 3 days, and then we dropped another one, and finally, they surrendered. Let's see. Potsdam Conference, you got to know it. This is when the Allies call for an unconditional surrender of Japan. You are beat. You cannot stop us. We have the ultimate weapon. You must surrender. All right, total of the war. Different numbers. 50 million. I've seen that one. I've seen anywhere between 50 and as high as 75 million people. Again, it's hard to, records weren't fantastic even in the 1940s. There's a lot of poor people out in these farms and stuff that aren't accounted for, that you don't know exactly how many kids they had and stuff. So it was a staggering number of people. Another 100 million people are wounded. We just never seen anything like this. It's twice as bad as World War I, and it leaves us with an atomic age. It's probably the worst legacy of World War II, that it's going to usher in the Cold War. And the dropping of nukes could annihilate far, far more people than what the conventional war of World War II did. Fortunately, we haven't got there yet. But as you will see for the rest of this year, it's all Cold War. It's going to be communism versus democracy. All right. That should get you going, guys. That's just an overview of World War II. Of course, you could spend an entire 3 months on World War II. There's so much to it. A lot of fantastic stuff. But make sure that you hit some of the biggest themes, like the isolationist versus interventionist. I think that's pretty important. Make sure you remember what your chart, your Atlantic Charter, your Potsdam Conference, your Tehran Conference. Try to keep those separated. Know that this is a launching point for the civil rights movement, and that minorities and women try to use this to their advantage. Double V campaign, victory at home and victory abroad. You get some racial tensions in the Zoot Suit riots. We had some bad stuff by interning the Japanese Americans in concentration camps. And we finished it off with the dropping of the atomic bomb. FDR had just died, so he did not drop the atomic. He's the guy that had the bomb made, but he dies before he ever sees it drop. It'll be his vice president, Harry S. Truman, who has to make that terrible decision whether to drop the bomb or not. So we'll see you guys in class, and good luck.